All
Good
right.
morning.
Hi, guys. How are
Morning.
you?
Hello,
Good
hello.
morning. There we go. Welcome back.
Man,
Welcome back indeed. Yeah.
I am not built for this weather. I'm just telling you that. Like, right? It's
Are you
gonna be.
not? Oh,
I
I
am
love
not.
it.
I am not. Right?
Yes, hot, sticky.
No, no.
That's me. I'm ready for it.
Yeah, I'm there too.
All
I like the
all disgusting
sweltering.
words. Nope, nope. If I'm gonna be hot and sweaty, I want to be on the beach. All right.
Mm.
Like that is the only
Oh, we can
condition.
arrange that. Little caravan. That's fine.
I
Go
mean,
down to the beach
you're
and be
gonna
hot.
send me
That's
the
okay.
remote location for a Generation on the Rise beach edition. You know?
As you know, the recording of Generation on the Rise, you have to sort out your own sort of logistics and location. All you just
Mhm.
need is a microphone, headphones, and a computer,
And,
and then
and
we'll set you
internet
up. So you go to the
access.
beach and and internet access, right? So you go to the beach and we'll get you in. That's fine.
Oh, man,
Yeah, the thought crossed my
it's
mind
tempting.
because I was out of town last week of bringing my setup in the check through, but I am a notorious overpacker, and I already
Are you
like,
really?
oh my god, big time. And
I'm
I have
surprised.
improved. I'll tell you, I've improved over the years, and I've especially improved since making my commute to Belfont and back because I got to pack a bag now every week, and I've become really good at thinking about the necessities and making sure that it all kind of fits in my duffel. So I am getting better, but there was a
Right.
time when like I'm like, well, I know it's going to be 90 degrees all week, but what if we get a cold snap and I end up in maybe I'll throw 3 or 4 sweatshirts in there and a couple of
3 or
pairs of pants.
4. Oh my god.
Oh yeah, it's bad. It's
That's
bad.
great. So this is
Too
Generation on
much.
the Rise, and we go there. What is the most common thing that you pack that you don't actually need for conferences?
Well, that I don't need for
When you go
conferences?
to conferences that you bring that you're like, "I didn't need this."
You know what? I'm gonna say my laptop, right? Like, I've
You don't
always yeah,
Mm.
I know, hot take, I've stopped bringing my laptop places, right? Like, and I used to take it when I travel for ICMA for the board meetings. I used to take my laptop and say, "All right, I'm gonna go, read my emails and whatnot." And you know what? Maybe I open that thing, like, once or twice because 'cause I'll just check it on my phone. And I've made a
We are
conscious
not the
decision
same.
this year.
Nope.
I'm like, "Nope, I'm not bringing my laptop. If there's emails, I can use my phone. If I have packets I
Yeah.
need to go through, I have a small little tablet I can go through. No tablet.
Tablet makes it a little better.
Like, no laptop. I've made that decision."
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not built like that at all.
For me, it's extra
Dave?
socks. I mean, it's stupid, but like again, notorious overpacker. I'll take whatever I need, like and I'm saying socks, but you can extrapolate that to mean all the other like kind of clothing items, and I just like
Got it.
multiply like 3 extra days. Like, what if my flight gets canceled, or what if I like get stranded on the side of the road? I mean, these are the like the chaotic things that go through my brain. I'm like, well, just to be safe, I'm going to throw in an extra 3 or 4, pairs of this, that, or the other thing. And I never end up using them. My wife gives me a hard time about it all the time. And like I said, I'm working on it. I'm in a 12-step program, and it's getting a
That's
little bit
pretty good.
better. Yeah, it's getting a little better.
See
How
see,
about
on
you?
the yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I bring too many different types of outfits because like I never really know what we're gonna get into. So I feel like I've got like the formal and then like the business casual
Right.
and then the casual, but it's still a conference and then like the casual. And it's just like I brought too many t-shirts. Like I didn't need all these. Like,
And nothing is
it's
more
tough.
embarrassing than like going to like an outing or something, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's black tie," and you're like, oh, I don't, man, I like,
That happens to me all the time. All of the time. Like Brandon will
yeah,
tell you
yeah.
when we were at ICMA, I would like text and be like, yo, what are you gonna wear to
What are
this
you
event?
wearing? Yeah,
Because yeah, which is like feels ridiculous. Like as an adult, like a grown man to be like, hey buddy, like what are you planning on wearing to this thing? And then you
We
gotta
gotta
send that
match
text 3
outfits,
or 4
right?
times so you can be in the majority. Yeah, we gotta coordinate. Because you don't want to be underdressed or overdressed. And I will say there were times, even still, we've been going to these conferences for years where that happens to me, where I'm like
Yeah.
not hitting it. I almost, for ICMA specifically, I think they should put out like a recommended dress code for things, but
Well,
that's probably
with
not
the
going to happen.
we do have, like, a dress code, like, and this is a fun little fact, the ICMA board has a handler, right? We have a member of staff that kinda tells us, "Hey, this is business casual. Hey, this is formal. This is," you know she's our rock, and, we're always looking to her, like, "What should I wear
Mm,
for a set
yeah.
event?" 'Cause,
Yeah.
there's 21 of us on the board, so, someone needs to herd us. So,
And
you
you
know,
guys check a bag when you travel or do you carry on?
I
Dave, with
hate
your overpacking, I feel like you check.
yeah. Oh, I'll check. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm a
Well,
carry
Not
on.
me.
Your
I am,
Carry
carry-on.
on all day long. Carry on.
but
Yep.
I am mortally afraid that my luggage is gonna end up in some faraway land, so I always, carry on.
Has that ever happened to you though? Have you ever had a airline lose your luggage?
No, it is an
Me neither.
unfounded fear.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But
phobias
anyway,
are
One time I
phobias.
was flying to London through Boston. I was going to Heathrow, and I had only checked golf clubs. So I carried on everything else, but I had golf clubs under the plane because I was going to ultimately end up in Scotland and I was going to play golf. And there was a delay getting from Dulles to Boston because of the fog around Boston, which is very normal. That caused me to miss the plane going to Heathrow. That wound up not being a big deal. We got on the next plane, which was like 3 hours later, going to Heathrow. So what could have become a really complicated thing wasn't. So that was good. And I was like, well, what's going to happen with these clubs? I'm sort of curious. I was like, well, I don't know, think about it. So sort of got on the overnight flight to Heathrow, landed down to baggage claim, went over to, I forget the airline now, a thing. And I said, hey, this is what happened, back in Boston. What do you think? And she kind of looks, types in the computer. She goes, that cart, do you see your bag? And I turn around, here's a cart coming out. And sure enough, they're in my club.
there you
Hey,
go.
oh,
Hey, how
Yeah.
about
That all
that?
worked out.
of course,
Yeah,
somebody
it all
stuck
worked
a
out.
one iron in it, and
Yeah.
where the hell did that come from?
That's
Oh,
I
right.
used to check my guitar. I used to bring my guitar around with me when I would go places, and I stopped doing that because one time I was looking out the plane window and I saw a luggage handler like just launch it.
oh,
And thankfully I had it wrapped like in the case. I had it wrapped in bubble wrap. It
Yeah.
was in good shape. But after that, I was like, I'm
mm.
not bringing those on planes anymore, and
That's tough.
haven't ever since. But yeah, I always check a bag because otherwise I'd be lost.
You gotta fit your
There you
12
go.
pairs of socks too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Our
at
listeners
least
have to be wondering what this episode is going to be about.
Yes, and we
edition
got
of
there.
Generation on the Rise.
We're
Yeah.
gonna talk about travel habits and, how many socks do you really need to pack?
Frequent flyer miles.
So I'm taking lead today, so happy to be here. This is Generation on the Rise. I'm joined with my good friends Dave and Eden, and today we're going to talk about housing, right? Not only just housing, but affordable housing. And the one thing that I want to start and frame our conversation is that we really want to make this conversation about affordable housing more than just this abstract national debate, right? Everyone has heard, oh, we have a housing crisis, we have a housing crisis. But what does that mean at the local level, right? So I think, the most natural place to start is what is affordable, right? Affordable is going to be different for different people, different places. Here outside Philadelphia, right? Even affordable is going to be way different than where Dave is at in the center regions of the county. So I guess I want to start with the question, what is affordable, guys?
Yeah. And I would even like I'm not gonna I don't know what the answer to that is. I know what it is for me, but I think there's also a huge generational component to this because what is affordable, I mean, we have a housing market that applies to everybody. You're not going to have an affordable housing product for, the millennials and then an affordable housing product for the Gen Xers. And, it is what it is. And you got to figure out, but everybody in those generational cohorts is going to have very different definitions of affordability because they're going to have different, they're going to have different needs as far as what bills they have to pay, as far as what commitments they have to pay. One of those, and I banged this drum 1,000 times before. One of those variables is student loans.
Yeah.
When you talk about like all of the things that are putting pressure on generations in different forms, I think student loan debt is an enormous burden that is kind of unchecked when you calculate it, or when you apply that variable into the calculation of what is affordable. We might be, if you're 25 years old and you have $100,000 in student loan debt, you might have a job that's making 80 to 100,000 a year, but you can't afford the same product as somebody who is 20 years your senior and has no debt in student loans. Yeah,
Do you guys
it's
have,
moving.
do you,
Eden, I do
do
want
you
to
guys have
hear
student,
I do want to hear your thought, but Dave, I wanted to just, I agree, right? There are so many pressures, but that hasn't really stopped the market, right? It hasn't really, at least around here in Philadelphia, it hasn't really kind of materialized anything, right? Like you have all these expenses, you have all these pressures placed on, especially, all individuals, different generations, but we continuously see these markets skyrocket in terms of value, selling costs, rents. So I acknowledge and I agree that we have all these different pressures, but my observation is it hasn't really produced anything. Would you agree with that? Or like tell me what it's like in Center PA. Are we seeing a dip in market prices and rents?
Well, I've got some fresh insight on that, but I think to a degree, yes. I think, compared to a few years ago when housing prices were just going up gangbusters and there was no guide rails on it, and people were getting 8, 9, offers all in excess of their asking price, all cash, waiving inspections, making, no contingencies. I mean, that I think has leveled out largely in the center part of Pennsylvania, at least, and up here in New York where I am too. I can't speak for obviously every market in the country, but definitely starting to see a little bit less pressure on some of those price points for housing. It's not anywhere that brings, somebody who's lower to middle class closer to the American dream. I mean, we're not there, and I don't know how we go back there short of some major economic downturns, which of course nobody wants to cheer for or hope
Yeah.
come to fruition. But things are at least plateauing, I think, to a degree.
Eden, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is an incredibly challenging topic and one that is difficult to talk about. I think every time I sort of have the quote unquote affordable or attainable housing conversation, I always try to get into the details with whoever I'm talking with to understand exactly what they're talking about because the conversation can go in so many different ways. And the way that I approach that is to try to have a data conversation. Are we talking about all housing? Are we talking about owner occupied? Are we talking about rental? Are we talking about this within a certain percentage of AMI, area median income?
Hmm.
Are we talking about this within a certain perspective of Alice as part of the
Alice.
conversation? What are we really talking about? And then let's try to have that conversation. Are we talking about people being able to afford housing on their own, or are we willing to sort of calculate this idea that there's going to be two incomes? What are we dealing with? Because there's so much nuance to these conversations that I'm not sure how simple it is to sort of have it. All that to be said, that I think the idea of affordable is sort of in the eyes of the beholder, right? If you as a consumer, there's a couple of things that you're considering as a consumer, right? Where do I want to live? What's my current income? What's my income earning potential over the course of time that I'm going to be, wherever it is they're going to live? Do they have a need for owner occupied? Are they willing to sort of not own? And what does that mean? And then there's a conversation of what can we afford and what do we want to afford? For those that know me would say I'm rather frugal. I don't like to spend money. So what I can afford and what I want to afford, two very different numbers.
Well, and to beat up that point a little bit more, because I think you're absolutely right, there's a ton of nuance here. I think that is illustrated with us as as managers and in our in our organizations, because there's not even a consistent word for it. I've heard affordable housing, workforce housing, inclusionary housing, universal housing,
Attainable
if you want it,
housing,
attainable housing.
yeah. A plus
There's
housing.
yeah, there's so just the fact that like there's no industry, nomenclature that we can all agree on. The kind of, I think
Well,
the go-to, the
well,
default is affordable is 80 to 120% area median income, and then we've got below
but
that we've got yeah.
I think the different terms are because people are trying to have different conversations,
Yeah,
right?
that is
If there
absolutely
was a
true.
conversation, like the city of Charlottesville is really on top of trying to address the homelessness, chronic homelessness, imminent homelessness within their city, right? I think their point in time count when I was there was like 272 people were either imminently or chronically homeless. And I say using I should be saying unhoused. I apologize. The unhoused population. There is a portion of that community that is trying to talk about affordable housing within like the 0 to 30% AMI
Yeah.
aspect. Well, that's really tough. If you're making 0% of the area median income up to 30%, where are you going to live? That's a
Yeah.
really challenging question. However, that city also has a challenge for people trying to find and secure housing between the 75% to 120% AMI. Those are two different conversations. If you
Mhm.
can afford housing at 80% AMI, that might be a good thing, but you've done nothing for people who are at 0 to 30%.
Right.
Um,
And that
so
gets
I
to the
think that,
crux of the
just to
issue,
wrap up
right?
what I was saying, I think that's why there's so many different terms, because there's so many different types of conversations happening.
Yeah, and when those municipalities and those local governments are getting involved in this housing conversation, right? And we tossed out affordable, attainable, inclusionary. There's supportive housing, right? And to your point, Eden, those are different conversations, right? And oftentimes, especially in my experience, because Lower Marion is, in the thick of housing issues, and we are actively addressing and developing housing policies, is, where do you address, right? Do you focus on workforce housing, which is generally about like 80 to 120% AMI, which is the area median income? For listeners who don't know, the federal government does, income levels on an area basis. And for at least Eden and I work on in the Philadelphia area median income. So there is like one set of federal regulated numbers for housing. I'm not sure which area you're in, Dave, but, I'm sure there's one in central PA too. But, that kind of is the litmus for what is affordable in the eyes of the federal government, right? But what is affordable in the eyes of the
Which is
local
a
government?
flawed number, by the
It
way.
is
Oh,
a
yeah.
flawed
Like,
number.
basing things off AMI is deeply flawed.
Correct.
Absolutely. Because,
It's the least
Like, we
bad
have
option.
problem.
Yeah.
not to throw shade at Philly, but, the Philly number depreciates, that area median income, right? Because we live in there are some wealthy suburbs outside Philadelphia, right?
Yeah, I think you're in the wealthiest one, Brandon.
We, yeah,
I think Lower Marion is the wealthiest suburb in the
yes, it
Philadelphia
is.
region.
Yes, it
Gotta be
Correct
is.
me
up
if I'm
there,
wrong.
yeah, for sure.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is. So we know for a
yeah.
fact that the
Some of the
area
most
median
expensive real
income,
estate
yes, we do have,
is yeah.
the wealthiest zip code, the wealthiest man in Pennsylvania lives in our township, fun stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But, you know, we're not blind, or we are well aware that the area median income is a flawed system that the federal government makes us use, essentially. And I don't blame them, right? It's hard. How are you going to develop area median incomes that is universally applied for a program that is national in scale? It's hard to do. And
Well,
that kind of goes to the point of, what is affordable? It means different things for different people.
but let's not bury the lead. You're talking about, Lower Marion developing affordable housing policies in the most expensive municipality in the state,
Yes.
or one of the most expensive municipalities to live in the state. Let's talk about the foundational question. What is local government's role in providing for affordable housing? I mean, what can we do?
Or should
And
we,
can I
right?
just, with that, can we just ask a couple? I mean, let's just have a database conversation here for a minute, Brandon. So we'll put you on the spot. Hopefully, you're ready for this pop
Ah,
quiz. What is
uh,
the vacant property rate in Lower Marion?
our vacant property, we actually had a
Do you have
housing
any?
action plan. It is lower than the national average. The number,
I'm sure it's like 1%, if anything.
I
Do
think
you
it's
have any
I think it's under
properties?
one. I think it's under
Yeah,
1%, honestly.
I'm
Mm,
sure.
wow.
National
Do you have
average
any
is about
properties?
3 to 5.
Right. Do you have any properties that are showing up on the sheriff sale list in Lower Marion?
We do, but it's, few and far between.
Few and far between. Okay.
Yeah, because our
Mm,
estates, the
sure.
housing stock in Lower Marion varies, right? Like we
Right.
have,
Right. Right. Right.
our most affordable housing is, those neighborhoods closest to Philadelphia, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And the further you get away
Um,
from Philadelphia, we are starting to get into estates that are literally 7 figures in value.
sure. So, do you have businesses in your downtowns, which there's like some Main Street small shops in Lower Marion that are like shutting down or closing up or having weird hours because they're having staffing issues
No,
in your community? No. Okay.
no.
And are you hearing from the business community that they're unable to sort of house their business in Lower Marion and may have to relocate because they don't have workers that can sort of support their industry?
None.
Okay, last question. Is the daytime population in Lower Marion higher than the nighttime population?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, and this is going to sound deeply insensitive, and it is not intended to, it is just sort of a database conversation. What actual problem is the local government trying to solve in Lower Merion. And like, by the way, I agree. Attainable housing, affordable housing, housing crisis in the US, all of those things are significant issues. And I agree they're significant issues and that we sort of need to work together across layers of government and involving NGOs and nonprofit. Like, we
Yeah.
certainly need to solve it. But if we just look at, in this case, Lower Merion in a box, what problem are we trying to solve? It's not an economic one, right? It's not a property based one. It's not an industrial one. Like, what's the problem?
Well, the problem is faced, right? One is the fact, and we kind of hinted at it in your questions, right? Is that there are a lot of workers who are just they can't live here, right? And I'm
Sure.
one of them, right? Like I will be free, and
Yeah, but
I
what's your
was
commute?
my commute is about 20 minutes, so it's not terrible,
Okay.
right? It's
Yeah,
not
my heart does
terrible.
not break for you.
Yeah. But I've had to make commutes in other communities, which we're like 45 an hour, right? So,
Yep,
still acceptable, but, not out of the realm of possibility.
I
But
agree.
there are others, we actually, said it before, we had a housing action plan and housing assessment conducted last year. And, we estimate that there are about a little under 49,000 employees that work in Lower Merion that cannot live here, right? And I'm not talking about those who, want to live in here and can't. It's not even an option, right? They come to the community, they work, daytime population spikes, which most communities do, right? Unless you're a pure bedroom community, and then they leave, right? From an economic development standpoint, we want to attract workforce housing, on one side of it, so that we have more of our workers living in town, so that they're spending more time in town, so that they're going to our local restaurants, our local shops, and they're spending, driving economic activity here locally, right? That's one part of it. And the other part of it is that our board has opted for, I won't say a moral argument, but it's definitely on, within the context that we know we are the wealthiest community and that, prices are going up, the values are going up, right? Our transfer tax has been nice. I will no hiding that, right? But the fact is that there are some longtime residents here that are being priced out of their homes, right?
Well, I think
Whoa.
how are they time out? How are they being priced out of their home?
Well, we have an aging population, right? That, they either sell their property or what have you. And we have
Ooh.
private investors who are coming in, buying it, rehabbing it, flipping the house, and selling it at exorbitant prices.
So we're talking about renters, not owner occupied residents?
Well, that was an example of an owner occupied. We have an individual, who's elderly, sells their home. They've lived in it forever, right? And we have an investor coming in and buying it and either converting it into a rental or sometimes a short-term rental or, a
I don't
long-term rental
understand.
or an Airbnb.
So in theory, if somebody lives in their house for a long time, it's probably no debt on the house. Hopefully they paid their mortgage off
Yep.
if they lived there for a long time. And so they sell it. They sell it to somebody else and then they continue to rent their house. Is that what you're saying?
They own their house, then they sell their house, which, good for them. They're free to do that, right? And
Sure.
then,
Right.
we have investors coming in, buying the house, right?
Okay.
And then selling the house or, selling that house for exorbitant price or renting that house
Right.
out at, rates that the market demands. And
Market
market
rate.
here in Lower Merion is is an incredibly high market, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm sure
only
rents
a
are over
select number of
$3,000. Yeah.
individuals can live here. So that is one of the cruxes that we
So
are
I
trying to
guess
address.
and Dave will be able to contribute to this too. I still don't, and I'll stop beating you up on the example, Brandon, but I don't understand how that person got quote unquote priced out of their house because in Pennsylvania, the tax law at the local level doesn't allow for automatic reassessments of your
No.
property. And so it's different in every county, right? Because some counties will reassess more regularly. Others, like Bucks County, like never reassess. And so you have $1 million homes that are being taxed on a rate of $30,000.
Right.
So the tax liability growth, I would argue, is generally not that significant at the local level. And I'm talking about municipal government, school districts, and county, right? And I'm not going to say that there's not growth there. And I'm not going to say that that growing tax liability for some people in the Commonwealth isn't at a level that can't be sustained by them. I'm sure that's true, but I'm not sure that it's true the overwhelming majority of the time. right? And so if your home is not being reassessed regularly and the tax growth, which is, by the way, regulated by the state anyway, municipal governments are capped, schools can only go up, however much Act 1 allows, that tax liability likely isn't growing at a rate that's literally pushing people out of their house. In Virginia, houses are automatically reassessed every other year. And so you get effective tax increases, even if the local rate doesn't go up, that are pretty significant. Sometimes 20%, 30%. During COVID, it was even more than that because the value of real estate was going up. In those situations, people are literally getting taxed out of their house because if they bought a house that was valued at $200,000 and then they lived through COVID, where there's automatic reassessments every other year and an explosion in real estate and the real estate market, and all of a sudden they're living in a $500,000 or $600,000 house, sure, their tax liability may price them out of their house. But I'm not sure that's happening in Pennsylvania. So when we say that people are getting priced out of their longtime owner-occupied housing, I for one, don't fully understand.
I think the issue, I mean, it's a great question. And as you guys are talking, I'm struggling to come up with a good answer to your prompt, Eden, because it's a full question that we often just don't ask ourselves, which is, why do we need to have affordable housing in our communities? If the market is putting upward pressure on real estate values and people are willing to pay that price, I'm looking back on my bookshelf here for my Milton Friedman collection because he was the invisible hand of the economy guy. What do we have as far as what responsibility do we have? Why would we fight that? I mean, I agree it is a laudable goal to build a community that provides for housing product that can accommodate to all areas of income earners and all people in all walks of life. But the why in that, it's nebulous. It's hard to pin down. I think the question when we frame the conversation in terms of how people are getting priced out of their homes, the question of what causes that or what contributes that is more of a macroeconomic one. It's more about how housing prices drive costs of other sectors of the economy upward, and perhaps your ability to afford your mortgage is not necessarily reflective of your ability to afford your grocery bill and your gas bill and your other obligations, your student loan debt. And, that I think independently of your assessed value, which is largely stagnant in Pennsylvania, is equally, and perhaps in some cases more so, an impact on your ability to afford to live, in general, in air quotes, live. But I don't know that I have a good answer to that question. And you're kind of introducing this like philosophical debate in my own mind, this existential kind of conversation. I mean, I was like, because I've always felt, and I'm just, horn tooting here, that part of my role in local government, what I want to look back as my legacy in management is working with my boards and councils on being able to provide attainable housing and be able to build a community that's affordable for all, individuals to live in and work in and visit and all that other stuff. But I guess I never really thought too much about why is that so critical? I mean, to me it is because it's important in my, to my social fabric, my goals as a manager, as a municipal administrator. But it is a fair question to ask, and we shouldn't just assume that we have a responsibility in local government to put our thumb on the scale and make housing affordable for all demographics.
Let me give an example, right? Kind of home ownership, right? You have an elderly individual. They've lived in the house for, they raised their family, but now that individual is by herself. The house is simply too big. Right? And they can't handle the house anymore. Right? With me? So they want to downsize. They want to go from a 4-bedroom to a 1-bedroom or whatever. Right? They sell their home. Right? And they want to buy a smaller, cheaper home. Right? But what we're seeing here, at least in Lower Merion, is that the home prices, granted, they could probably sell that house for a lot, but the home prices
much more than what they bought it for.
Correct. Back in, whenever, even if they built it, my mother-in-law's family, they built their home on Long Island and they sold that house for, a lot of money. Right. But, they want to go somewhere within the community, but that is smaller. Now, what they're going to get is they're going to get a diminishing return if they're even able to find a house, which, many people might not even be able to find a house. here in Lower Merion because the market is that hot. A house will go on the market and it will be gone, pretty quickly, just like that, right? So, I'm giving, seniors as an example, but, there are instances where people just can't handle the house anymore, either because, they want to downsize or because they can't afford the repairs or what have you, right? So our board has opted, we have an obligation, from a local government standpoint to help those individuals, not only just seniors, but individuals who want to live here and, help correct the market. I'm going to use that term, correct the market to a degree to offer those lower cost options, right?
So you're saying that you're bored, right? I mean, there is like traditional public policy theory about when government intervention is necessary or required. And one of them is a market failure. And so you're arguing that there is a market failure and that therefore government intervention is necessary.
Yes, that is our perception, that the market has gone ramshot, whether you agree with that or not, and that Lower Merion Township and local governments across our region, and we're not alone in this. There are a few others that are kind of getting into the fray. We should help
Yeah.
facilitate. We're not going to solve it. Like local government is not going to solve this problem, but it is worth the fight.
Okay.
So,
Interesting.
so you talk about the market going out of control, and I agree with you in principle that the role of local government and government in general is to correct course when the market is not able to do it in and of itself. We're all capitalists, I think. I mean, I certainly am. And I don't want to rob anybody of their ability to attain their dreams. By the true grit that is the American spirit. But at the same time, I do think it's a valid question of is this one of those paradigms? Is this one of those areas where we have a role to play? And I mean, there's a lot of blame, quite frankly, to go around for the reasons that the housing market has got to the point where it is. And I've always been very vocal in my career that some of that blame is shared by government itself. When I was dealing with the builders in State College in Ferguson Township in the early part of my career, and we were talking about affordable housing. And first of all, like Happy Valley, one of the reasons, at least that I've heard anecdotally, that it's called Happy Valley is because the housing market and the economy in general has been so, to economic downturns, even in the '08 housing crisis. Yeah, you saw it, maybe dip a little bit, but not to the same degree that you saw it around the country and around the world. And I never really, in the 10 years I was there, fully understood why. I talked to people as well, it's because there's a university there. Yeah, okay, that's part of it. But you can't account for all of the housing, the skyrocketing housing costs just because Penn State University happens to have their main campus located downtown. It's not like they're paying all their faculty, 7-figure salaries or anywhere close to that. So, there's a lot of variables. And one of those variables is the cost to build. We need to be honest with ourselves. How expensive are building permits in your community? How expensive is the process to get land development approval, to get subdivision approval? I mean, those are true, actual, reasons in part, not the whole pie, but a piece of the pie that contribute to the unaffordability of home ownership. And when I started to really shake that tree in the State College market, I got a lot of resistance from the government industrial complex saying, no, I'm sorry, we can't consider building permit prices independently for affordable housing versus market rate housing, because we have to treat everybody fairly. And here's how it was all the kind of taglines that you hear from, well, I'd love to provide affordable housing. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. It's not fair to put that all on the private sector. We do, as government, have a role beyond the policy setting, beyond forcing through ordinances and regulations how we require, obligate, provide for housing at all different levels, although there is a role to play there too, in how we contribute to the cost of building. And we have to be honest with ourselves. Yet another influence of that is, and I'm going to pick on realtors for a moment, because I do believe that as a stakeholder group, we're able to they in many cases inflate those housing prices and drive that market upward, and not they've kind of avoided any blame, so to speak, for all this. And I got some realtors who are great friends of mine. I think highly of a lot of them and their industry. But when I was having these conversations in State College with the Realtors Association about why we need to have workforce housing ordinances and regulations in place, and they were giving me the pushback that they were giving me, and I surveyed the parking lot to see brand new sports cars and BMWs and Lexuses and all this. And I thought to myself, really, I mean, how are you going to tell me out of one side of your mouth that realtors have no involvement in the affordability of home ownership, and that you think that the market is doing what it needs to do left independently of government intervention and regulation? And then on the other side, you seem to be doing pretty well for yourself. No shade on them. I don't mean to target the realtors associations, but I do believe truthfully that they have a lot to do with the costs of housing, and that the solution to it has to involve the realtors, has to involve government, and has to involve builders. It's got to involve everybody.
We talked about it earlier. It is such a complicated, nuanced, conversation. It's kind of like the blooming onion of issues, right? And the more you peel it, the more layers there are that you uncover. And, I'm still a little upset that while I was away, you guys started talking about strong towns. And I was like, of course they picked the week I'm
Oh, that's what
away.
happens when you go away, Brandon.
I mean,
Yeah.
but strong towns, Chuck Marone, I've been following them for years. They came out with a housing book, which, I'm about midway through. But, and anyone who wants to learn more about affordable housing, I highly encourage, that as a good read, and he basically breaks this whole affordable housing discussion down into, well, what is causing this, right? Dave, you're talking about realtors and, the demand side, right? Like there is demand there. Realtors are going to make a buck. These investors are going to invest in homes as, investments as, value add. But then there are other individuals, the advocates on the other side of the issue that are saying, it's a supply issue. We need to build more. Which goes to your point, building new units is expensive.
It's expensive. Yeah.
We have a $20 million housing project that is only going to produce 48 units, $20 million for 48 units. But that is, that's the market. That's what it costs to build things. And, from my point of view, where a lot of people, not go wrong, but they mistake that they only look at one side of the equation and they really don't look at both sides. It's not just a supply issue. It's not just a demand issue. It's also a financial capital issue.
Right, I agree. And I'm not, and just to be clear to any realtors who may be listening, may know, I am not trying to castigate the Realtors Association. We shared the supply side shares blame, and everybody's involved in contributing to that, as well as everybody who's involved in fanning the flames on the demand side. And, it takes a unified effort, and it's not an easy problem to solve, but we all have to come to the table and say, yeah, we're willing to, actually make some real commitments to establishing affordable housing stock in our communities.
But what do those commitments look like, Dave or Eden? If the local government should get involved in housing, right? Which I think at least Dave and I are on the side of, yeah, we should. I don't want to speak for you, Eden, but what should they do? What does that action look like? Because I think that's another area where kind of those who aren't in the topic or in the challenge don't know where to start, and they spin their wheels. Is it building new units? Is it, a regulatory, actions to deal with the market?
I'll tell you what, it's not. It's not in having, I hate to pick on this, it is not in having summits full of, different stakeholder groups bloviating about why they feel affordable housing is important in their communities. And then you walk away until we convene another summit and talk about the same.
No, I'm in the
gosh,
same
Dave.
boat.
You might get canceled.
You know what? No, I'm gonna back Dave up on this one.
It's not that I disagree in bringing people around the table, but if you're gonna come to the table, be ready to write checks. Be ready to make real, tangible, objective commitments. Don't just talk about how you're committed to the philosophy, and don't talk about all the things you can't do. Think outside the box. Be innovative.
Yeah, I'm gonna back
I
Dave
will
up on that
say-
one. Like I've been in a few of those type of events, and I applaud everyone attending, everyone showing an interest, but then, what are you doing? All right, that is my question. All right, well, great. You're talking about this, you're talking about that, and there was an instance, Eden, I won't disclose where or who was involved, but I had the same conversation with you. Remember that a couple months ago? I was like, great, we had
Yeah.
this thing. Yeah, everyone said, oh
Now what?
yeah, affordable
Uh,
housing, this and that. And it's like, okay, but what are they doing?
yeah, but hold on. I mean, think about the mindset of the advocate, right? I mean, in order to spur large groups of people who have influence like us to action, there has to be advocacy. Well, part of the advocacy playbook is bringing awareness and talking about it. If we never have sort of those in any issue, I don't pick any issue under the sun. If you never have sort of those initial conversations, summits, groups of people talking about things, passing out flyers and pins and signs and all that, then it's never going to sort of motivate decision makers and influencers to do something because it doesn't rise to that level. So I think,
That's a fair point.
while certainly as practitioners, we might be in these summits going, okay, another conversation about XYZ, that's necessary in order to get us and people who we work for in order to spur into action. So I think there's a reason that we're doing it, and I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, that's fair.
My perspective is sort of the data, right? I'm sort of back to it. I've had some pretty candid offline conversations with builders and developers and just said, like, let's talk about this in terms of segments of the pie. Because there's this notion out there that developers are making a fortune and that that's really the reason. And that doesn't I'm not saying it's not true in all cases, but it doesn't seem to be true in, I would argue, the majority of cases, right? Like, I don't think that there's like this silver bullet that if you become a developer, all of a sudden you're going to easily make a fortune because we're price gouging on the sale of houses, right? There's market considerations involved. There's cost of building materials involved. There's cost of actually going through the development process that Dave sort of outlined earlier that's involved. There's the cost of land. I mean, there's all of these things that sort of go that have to be taken into consideration. And so to me, in order to sort of drive down the price of something, you have to take a cost off, right? Like no one is going to do work for free. No one's going to give up their land for free. We're not, even local governments are not going to go through the development review process and permitting process for free. That's not going to happen. So the question becomes, what piece of the pie can we remove from a cost perspective and then give that back to the projects, essentially taking a loss to drive down the total cost, right? There are communities around me that are building $1 million homes. I think the developer in the end is going to make what, 5 or 6% profit, which is significant, right? 5 or 6% on,
Like
if you
million pro-
build, $20, $1 million homes. Sure. That's a significant number, but think about the cost just to get there,
Right.
right? It's 94% of that home sale, times 20.
Systemic.
So if you want to drive down the cost, and I'm just using a million because it's a nice round number that's easy to
Yeah.
wrap our head around. If you want to drive down the cost of that 94 of that $1 million home, what part of the pie can we eliminate cost wise of that other 94%? I don't know the answer to that.
That's also shooting ourselves in the foot, right? Like, are we, and this is not us, but generally speaking, are we as a field talking about depreciating value on properties, right? That's like shooting ourselves in the foot. Like most of us are relying on property taxes, so it is it hurts us to drive down prices on property values, and I don't think anybody really wants to do that. That's not one of the goals, is to drive down property values or home values. But how do you do that while also making the home affordable? Right? That is like the catch 22, right? You can't make a house affordable really unless you depreciate the value, and you can't depreciate the value without depreciating the value on the property, and you can't depreciate the value on the property without negatively impacting township revenues.
If it was an easy problem to solve, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Yeah.
Systemic problems require systemic solutions,
Yeah.
and affordable housing is a systemic problem, and it involves everybody who's got a leg in the real estate market, in the building market, and in the regulatory market, or sector rather, that has to be willing to have real commitments. Yes, I agree. Those conversations in those conference rooms are critical. They are one step, but they are not the only step. And I think too often we in government and in other sectors as well that are involved in housing feel as though that's enough to continue the conversations, to keep it on the radar, to resolve the issue, and it's just not getting us there.
Yeah.
I
So
guess, yeah.
back to Brandon's question earlier, market failure, government intervention is necessary. Okay, so if we divide up the cost to build housing into the cost of the land, the cost of development process and engineering, the cost to actually build, and then everyone gets paid in the end. What part of that very oversimplified process are you willing to recommend that the government get involved in? And so I'll
Yeah.
just ask you this question. I'll ask you this question sort of bluntly. Government can buy property,
Yep.
and there's no laws saying that you can't buy property outside of your municipality. So and of course there's laws about how much you can pay,
Yeah.
you got to get appraisals and all that sort of stuff. We'll assume we all understand that. Is your government willing to either float a bond or use cash on hand to purchase blank canvas land and then partner with a developer and builder to build affordable housing? Because
We've
now, and
we've
then
done
take a
that.
loss on it.
Not purchased, but
Okay.
we've donated land. We've
Okay.
donated
Great. So
township
did that lead
property,
to affordable housing?
the 48
Did
units
you
I
did
referenced. Yep, we partnered with a nonprofit affordable housing developer, great outfit outside of in Philadelphia. We
Great.
donated an old 98 space parking lot, surface level asphalt,
There
field.
you go.
We donated the land. We partnered with the developer. We were able to leverage $1 million in American Rescue Act funds. Plus, we
There you go.
also have an affordable housing fund that we've set up
So
for, you know,
I tee this up to say if local governments want to get involved and actually like sort of streamline the process to get yourself to an end product that is affordable housing,
Yep.
the answer is sort of like money. Right? I mean, it's government intervention with taxpayer dollars.
Right,
I shouldn't
totally,
say the
and
answer,
well,
an answer,
totally.
one of the answers. One of
It can be privately funded. I mean, we do have the ability in Pennsylvania,
Sure.
at least, to obligate fees in lieu, for those kinds of things. I've
Yeah.
seen successful programs where, you have an ordinance that obligates this certain percentage of units in a in a built environment to be in that affordable, attainable, whatever you want to call it, price point, or they could buy out a piece of that. College Township in Center County has a good program that,
We have that too.
addresses that exact thing. Brandon was talking about it too in Lower Marion, and that builds a little bit of a that builds a little bit of a bankroll to be able to either approach a land bank program or a land
Yeah.
trust program where the government can then buy the land, contract with a builder to build the home buyers just buying the building itself. You put in some allowance for equity because you don't want somebody to buy a home that they're not going to be able to see any appreciation of either. So you
Well, I
build in
was going
some
to say
allowance
that.
for equity.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to
Yeah.
work out all that stuff on the front end so that you are keeping it in an affordable stock. I'll give you an example because they've resolved this. In Ferguson Township, we had an affordable housing ordinance that applied to one specific zoning district, and it required the units to be sold initially at an affordable price point, but then there was no guide rails on subsequent sales.
Oh,
So
that.
somebody who was
Mm.
savvy enough would have bought up every one of those units, turned around and sold them the next day at an exorbitant profit. Thankfully,
Yeah.
the board of supervisors in 2017 was clairvoyant enough. Also happened to have hired some new manager who flagged this as an issue, but I'm not going to name names or anything. Who was clairvoyant enough to resolve that, close that loophole a bit, but at the same time to provide for some
Yeah.
ability for that homeowner to earn equity, but not equity at the same level as a unencumbered market rate unit would otherwise perhaps earn in that state college market.
I totally get what you're saying. I get that. And I think that's good. Nice job flagging that, the whole deal. But what if we did
Whoever
that
did, I don't know who it
retroactively?
was.
Yeah. What if we did that retroactively? What if we, and this is not legal, we obviously can't do this, but let's just go through the thought exercise of saying, okay, we're going to pass an ordinance for a zoning district that any house bought in the 1970s and 80s can only sell for X% of current day market price. Those homeowners would have a cow.
Yeah.
I mean, there would be riots in that municipality. But that's effectively what you're doing when you build projects like this. Now,
Yeah.
again, I don't think that private equity or a savvy, one-off person should be able to come in and buy up a bunch of affordable units and sell them the next day. I obviously think that's a problem. However, if we're trying to help, in theory, this younger generation of people purchase homes, build equity, I mean, buying assets and allowing them to appreciate is wealth building. Right. I
Definitely.
mean, that's how that happens. Right. I mean, if you take somebody who works sort of a, factory job, right, where they're not sort of in the high income, tax bracket, if they someday want to have that $800,000 million home, it's buying sort of the starter home, building wealth, right, paying down that mortgage, allowing it to appreciate, selling it, and using that for their next acquisition. To buy down to make that more affordable. If we start handcuffing, people who are buying at an affordable rate now from that wealth building, we're only creating future problems for ourselves, 10, 20, 30 years down the line.
Yeah. And
Totally agree.
that's
Well,
why
let me
I'm just gonna jump in here, Dave. Sorry. That's
Yeah,
why I
sorry.
really
I
like
have a
first
question for you
time.
then, Brandon.
That's why I really like first-time homebuyer programs, right? Which is one of the other programs we offer, is that we actually go and we purchase homes. And, we purchase homes at market
Do you
rate.
really?
So we do. We purchase homes
Wow,
at
that's
market
great.
rate, right? And then we hand them over to a nonprofit, Lower Merion Affordable Housing. They do the work that, rehab, whatever isn't necessary. And then
Yeah,
we flip it and we sell it, at a reasonable price, and we assist with, the settlement costs for first-time home buyers. And we do
that's
that.
great.
We do that through our, our HUD, our Housing and Urban Development, our federal community development block grant dollars. So we're a direct
Nice.
recipient. So,
Mhm.
uh,
Are you parlaying that first time home buyer program with counseling for those home buyers, with assistance in that? Because I think to Eden's point, yeah, the intent of these offerings is for them to be starter homes
yeah.
for individuals and families who are entering the housing market, with the idea that this is not going to necessarily be your forever home. So it's important, in my opinion, and it is just an opinion, that those programs include also some counseling, financial coaching for some of those individuals and families to help them build that foundation, coupled with the equity, limited as it may be, in their ability to grow their home values in those first time homes that they own. And then hopefully that is what begets a successful home buying career for them, or whatever you want to call it, I guess, from there, that they can grow from that. I mean, is that something you're doing in Lower Merion?
Not us directly, but our affordable housing partner, Lower Merion Affordable
Nice.
Housing, which is his
Yeah.
own nonprofit, does offer credit counseling and home buying classes and all that
That's
stuff.
great.
I mean, when I say we're in the thick of it, we are, right? Like, and it's pretty
Yeah.
exciting, right? Like, I've never really had or been in a community that has really gone, jumped into the pool with both feet in terms of the housing issues, right? And you're going to
When did
find
all
that.
that begin? Like, yeah, I'm
Well,
sure you didn't build that overnight.
Last
no.
Thursday? No.
Well, yeah.
Last
How
Thursday.
long have I been here? 3. The CDBG stuff has been ongoing, but kind of like under the radar. It was dealing with affordable housing before affordable housing was like a mainstay issue. But really, like the donation of the land, the building of the construction, and all that stuff. Really, kind of like post COVID. Really, our board set up
Okay.
an ad hoc affordable housing committee, right? And now they've continuously meet. They meet every month, with staff, and it's really driving housing policy, right? Like we're looking at ADUs right now, right? And what does ADUs, look like in terms of zoning regulations, and where should they be allowed, and what should, our target number be, and what are we doing about short-term rentals, and should we be regulating those? So, we do have a policy body that meets on a regular basis that help, is driving the ship, so to speak. But I would say post-COVID.
So how do you overcome the NIMBYism, the not in my backyardism, which I think is another variable? I don't want to exonerate, as part of the macroeconomic scope of this problem,
Yeah.
the members of a community who are just, perhaps they pay a lot of lip service to the importance of having affordable housing and affordability in their communities. But when they look out of their backyard and they start to see those multifamily units come up out of the ground, or
Yeah.
those townhouse products come out of the ground, they may be the first ones. I had a former manager and mentor call it the drawbridge effect. Hey, we moved in here. Now we want to pull the drawbridge
Yeah.
up. No mas. This is it.
I
Yeah.
literally was just speaking with a community that is dealing with some of this issues, not with affordable housing. And they were like, we should start an HOA so we can make our community gated. I was like, oh my God. Okay.
I don't mean to
Build a
laugh,
moat.
but I just
Yeah.
pictured like them just building a castle around the community.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I don't know the answer to that. I do think having good master plans, a good comp plan that are consistent, that sort of call out these priorities of the governing body are important. And then I think selling that and sort of as an administrator, pointing back to those, saying, hey, like, this has been discussed publicly, it's been voted on, we put a lot of thought into this. This is not just on a whim, I think is really important. And then I think education around what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're not doing, because we know there's always a rumor mill and all that sort of stuff
Yeah.
that sort of enters the conversation is important. But I'm
And
not sure that
yeah.
there is a way to sort of like, I'm not sure there's a playbook to sort of talk to somebody, a NIMBY, and get out of that conversation, where they're no longer that.
Yeah.
But I do think it's nice in this society that NIMBY is like a dinner table term that people
It
know,
is.
Yeah.
We've
right?
now
Like it
It's
is
not in my
something
exactly.
backyard.
people know it. Yeah.
You
And
you
I
know,
think that helps.
I've always prescribed that education is always, the one of our strongest tools, right? And to Eden's point, we're not gonna convince, the diehards that are adamantly against, or in this case, affordable housing projects. That's just not gonna happen. But you educate and you communicate and you say, "This is the issue. This is why we're doing this. This is the government. This is your community choosing to do this," right? Like, I will say that when we donated the 98 spot parking lot, there was some opposition to that. Like, "No, I park there."
Yeah, I'm sure.
That's in the community. Why are you taking away parking? You can't talk about
Yeah.
Ardmore without talking about parking. And, we're saying, "Yeah, but understand that we looked at that lot. Out of the 98 spaces, roughly 20 are used, on a regular basis. There's plenty of other spots for those 20, users to use. Oh, and by the way, our other, senior affordable housing that was built in like the 80s, their wait list is over 300 individuals long, right? There is way more demand here, and that is why we are acting. And I would also encourage any community who kind of wants to start getting involved in affordable housing. One of the easiest, starter conversations is, senior affordable housing, right? Because, it makes sense and it's easy to understand, right? Grandma wants to live near the family. They want to live near the grandkids. They just want to live in a downsize. They don't want to deal with the hassle of home ownership, and they're on fixed incomes.
Hmm.
Seen.
Mic drop.
Yeah. Well, I think, not to have like a soundbite or anything, but, a
Mm.
lot of communities are using or viewing themselves as like thermometers, right? Like kind of checking the temperature, seeing what housing is like. And, we've kind of, and I'm fighting every dad, you know, urge in my body, you know, we need to be more like a thermostat where we adjust the temperature a little bit, right? We are actively, getting involved. And this is, if my kids are listening to this, which they'll never will, but don't touch the thermostat, I will get mad at home. But, that's the role of local government, right? We should be able to, you know, cool down the market a little bit or heat it up, in certain instances.
That's
Now
an
for
interesting take. I'm not sure that every local government in this country would agree with that.
Nope, and then that is just what works for us because we've identified housing as one of our priorities that we wanna get
Sure.
involved in.
Now, and we have the three of us, and I think a lot of folks in our orbit have kind of disregarded another, not intentionally or whatever, but just for the purposes of, I guess, tractability or how solvable the problem is, the rental market, which is such a important component to affordable housing. And yet when you think about the involvement of local government and all these other stakeholders, we have a tendency to boil it down to owner occupied, and rental is, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a subject for another episode. We don't have time to even scratch the
Yeah.
surface of it today, but I mean, that's something that's kept me up more than one night, especially in the state college market where student housing is such a driver of rental price points. I do blame the university in state college, not the university, but having a university as a huge driver of those rental housing prices. I think about that all the time. My first apartment with my wife was $600 a month for a one bedroom, and most of the utilities were included in that. Those opportunities don't exist for
Yep.
that generation on the rise. I don't know
But
I don't even
again,
know how to think about that.
it depends on where you live.
Yeah.
Sure.
It depends on where you live, the community that you live in, the amenities that they offer, the economy that's there. I mean, all those things play a factor.
Yeah,
Uh,
but I mean, find a market even adjusted for inflation where you could rent for 600 or whatever today's equivalent is with utilities included. Even the places in, even the markets that are traditionally maybe viewed as less desirable for people to live in, those rental price points are going up too. And I don't know what
And
happens.
I think in fairness to that, I think that's a question too, right? Like, are people earning an income wherever it is they work that is sustainable to allow them to live within reasonable commute distance of where they work? That's a question too. And that's not the housing side. That's sort of like the job market side,
Yeah.
Right.
which is part of the question. And
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Maybe
Clear your
we'll tack
calendars,
that
folks, because
onto
we're going to talk for another
yeah,
6
yeah,
hours today. I just
yeah.
gonna
Maybe we'll tack that onto residency requirements, right?
Yeah.
So,
So
regarding affordable housing, y again, as you heard, it is incredibly complex. We only scratched the surface. We didn't even get touch on, rental housing, right? Which has its own, unique flaw, issues when we're talking about colleges and students and whatnot. I mean, affordable housing, do you have a final, hot take? What should the role of local government and what should this new generation on the rise know about affordable housing in, 1 minute or less?
Yeah, I think public-private partnerships are in a nutshell, a crucial tool in this, or public and non-governmental NGO partnerships in the sense of housing and land trusts and community trusts or land banks. So, for those governments out there and municipal officials, elected, administrative, whatever, who are looking to resolve this problem, I would encourage you to overcome the historic, perhaps, reluctance in your communities to enter into some of those partnerships, because this truly is as I said before, and we'll pair it again, a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution.
Eden.
I would say if you're only talking about quote unquote affordable housing without data to back up the conversation and without definitions to clarify the conversation, you are doing the equivalent of screaming into the abyss. So try to figure out what exactly it is you're talking about, the different factors that are impacting it. We talked about AMI, Alice, the local economy, what's driving the conversation. Try to get specific and understand that problem in detail so you can figure out what solutions look like and who else needs to be at the table to help drive towards success.
Good take. And I'll just add, if you're a generation on the rise and you land a local government job and that community does view housing as a priority, there are municipalities out there, I know Seattle's involved. Yes, it's a big city, but there are communities out there that are doing things that can be scaled. You don't have to start from scratch. There are people having conversations and are actually doing things and putting policies into place to deal with the affordable housing issues. So, don't be afraid to reach out to individuals and communities that, Google search, see what people are doing. You don't have to start from scratch. All right. And with that, this has been Generation on the Rise. We're happy that you're listening in. Catch you on the next one.
Have a good week.
Take care.